Hi there, my name is George Bailey. I'm a lecturer here at York in the Department of Language and Linguistic Science. My expertise lies in social linguistics and also phonetics and phonology, and I'm especially interested in language change and dialectal variation in English. In the CPD workshop on Friday, I'll be presenting some of my work on, as the title says here, the graphical representation of phonetic dialect on social media. This is a relatively new line of research which combines the analysis of computer-mediated communication, specifically language use on Twitter, with our knowledge and understanding of regional variation in dialects of English across the UK. So obviously I'll go into more detail in the workshop itself, but in this video I just want to give you a brief teaser of the kind of topics I'll be covering and why I think it's interesting. So I'll start off with a brief 101 about language variation and change, which will probably be at least somewhat familiar to all of you, but I think it provides some useful framing for the topic that I'll be covering in the webinar itself. So without wanting to point out the obvious, language use is inherently variable. The way that we use language is influenced by a whole host of factors, both external, so things relating more to society at large, and also internal, so things relating more to the internalized linguistic system, the thing that exists in our brains. So there are lots of different factors that can influence it, things like the age, the gender identity, the regional background of the speaker, maybe their occupation and social class, things like that. But also properties of the wider context, maybe the formality and style, the purpose of what it is you're saying, what is the kind of wider context in that regard, how familiar are you with the people you're talking to, and also the kind of same properties of the listener. So when I was talking about age and gender and things like that about the speaker, well, we may speak differently if we're talking to a group of older listeners compared to younger listeners. So lots of different things, are playing a role here. And there's also properties of the words that can influence how we speak. So it could be the grammatical category or function of the word. Is it a more, kind of verb-like category or a more noun-like category? How frequent is the word? How predictable is it in the context? Duration. There's all sorts of things which can influence the way we speak at a kind of macro level, but also a micro level. If we think of very specific, individual instances, every word that I say, there are lots of different things that could influence how I pronounce that word, for example. And there's evidence of all of these things from literally decades of social linguistic research in what we call the variationist paradigm that was pioneered by William Labov in the 60s and many other scholars since then. And it really comes down to this idea, which I've put here in the slides, that Labov and others put forward in this classic paper from 1968 about orderly heterogeneity, which is basically a very fancy way of saying that the variation that we observe in language isn't just random and haphazard. There's an order to it and a structure and a system, and we can analyze and identify those patterns of variation within a community of speakers if we use experimental or observational methods. Now the topic of my talk will focus on two of these things in particular: so regional background, bringing in that kind of dialect variation aspect, but also formality and style in a way. So within this incredible range of linguistic diversity, there are some varieties that are seen as maybe more overtly prestigious than others. And this term, kind of overt prestige, refers to the fact that there are just certain ways of speaking, possibly associated with particular regions or social groups, that are more positively evaluated, speakers maybe being seen as more intelligent or professional. So I don't want to go into too much detail about this and about the notion of kind of standard language ideologies and received pronunciation and things like that. That's really a topic in and of itself. But for our purposes, a key point is that within any one of these varieties, they're kind of still particular linguistic features that themselves will carry more or less overt prestige or be more or less stigmatized than others. And if we focus specifically on style and formality, one of the factors that I mentioned on the previous slide, that idea of style, we know that speakers can actually shift between styles of speaking and adapt their use of language to, perhaps they'll just use more or less standard forms or stigmatized forms, depending on what they deem to be appropriate for the context. And also depends on, in part, on people's awareness. There are certain features that are more below the radar that we're not really as aware of, and as a result we might not change our use of that feature in the same way. Now, usually this kind of framework is applied to spoken language, but of course we can analyse written language in the same way. So for example, we might imagine a continuum of formality with very different styles of language use in, for example, broadsheets like The Guardian, or maybe when writing a letter compared to, sending a text message or a tweet, for example. Now, obviously in my talk, I'll be focusing on the latter. So specifically, social media platforms like Twitter, which are just an excellent resource on language use. And that's partly because there's just so much of it. There's approximately 500 million tweets sent every single day. But also just because it's so informal. And with that comes a tendency for people to explore innovative and creative new ways of using language. One example of these innovations is the tendency for new words to crop up. And many of them live very short lives before falling out of common use again, but some really do take off. Here's an example of the word fleek or on fleek, which came into use on Twitter quite suddenly, as you can see in the second half of 2014. And within that kind of area, there's lots of interesting things going on. In this particular case, there was the meaning generalized. So it started off just being used to talk about eyebrows. So somebody's eyebrows would be on fleek if they look good. And as it kind of got more and more frequent, it became generalized as a positive adjective that can modify anything. So in our data, we see things like, people saying, "Oh, this barbecue is on fleek." So that's really interesting. But what I'll be talking about is a bit different. In the webinar, I'll be focusing not so much on words themselves, but on how they're being used, how they're being spelt specifically. With a focus also on not just random variation in the spelling, but how users actually spell them in particular ways, quite creative ways, to more closely match their own pronunciation of that word in their own spoken dialect. So if we take a quite topical example at the moment, you might spell England in two different ways, like this or like this. And hopefully you'll agree with me, even though it's the same word, they denote quite different things. So the first, maybe it's hard to say, but it might conjure up an image of a kind of quaint English village surrounded by nature. The second probably conjures up something more like this, I would imagine, especially at the moment with football apparently coming home. Although by the time you watch this video, England might have been knocked out, so maybe I've just jinxed it. To take an example more closely related to the things I'll be talking about, the things I'm interested in, there are many different ways of pronouncing a word like think, and this is a kind of natural social linguistic tendency. There's a lot of variation in things like this. So the initial sound might be more of a t, it might be something like tink, like I've put up here. Or it might be more of like a f sound, like in think. And as you can see here, these differences in pronunciation are quite transparent in a way where you could actually, reflect it in the spelling. And in either case, you might automatically form a kind of mental picture of the word, or at least, a picture of the people who might say the word, or who might spell the word in this way. So maybe you might associate tink with a particular social group, or you might associate people who say think with a particular region, a particular dialect, or variety of English that's spoken somewhere in the UK or even across the world. And that's the kind of thing I'll be exploring in the webinar talk, the extent to which people make use of spellings like this, and also many other examples, to represent their own dialect and project some kind of linguistic or social identity on platforms like Twitter. So I'll be showing off lots of maps like these where we can look for regional patterns in these phonetic spellings, and how closely they match up with the regional patterns that we see in speech. So thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you there on Friday.